Morning, and we're delighted to have you all here today. I know it's morning for me in Maryland. It's evening for some of you. And are you able to hear me? Okay. Okay. All right. This is part of our regular Wednesday series on approaches for engaging with climate change, climate solutions, and climate justice. We will be repeating this presentation tonight at 9 Eastern, so please spread the word with other people if you think that this was worth your time, and get them to join us again in about 11 hours. So I'm delighted to introduce my friend Mike Hoffmann. I've known Mike for almost 20 years, I think, Mike. First through when Mike represented Cornell University at the Council of Environmental Deans and Directors, when he was involved in sustainability leadership at Cornell. And back in, I think about 2009, we had I was then with the National Council for Science and the Environment, and had a conference on climate solutions. And then we met with our environmental academic leaders and said, what do you need? And they said, well, we need curriculum. And so Mike was involved with us in helping to develop a project to help build environmental curriculum. Mike, and then we worked with him on some things related to climate change and agriculture, which is Mike's field as the former director of the Agricultural Experiment Station at Cornell. And when Mike, a few years ago, quote unquote, retired from Cornell, he didn't actually retire. He just transformed his work in climate change education to his full-time life work without the bureaucracy of the university. And Mike has been doing some amazing work, which we'll talk about today, in helping us to use food as a way to engage people on the conversation about climate change. And so I will turn to you, Mike, and thank you for being with us and for your great work.
Thank you, David. And yes, I guess we have known each other for quite a while. All good things. So as David mentioned, we essentially use food as a way to talk about climate change and tell the climate change story. And to the best of my knowledge, we all eat. And combined with our concerns about climate change, I think it's a twist on the typical way we think about agriculture and food in the climate change space, because we're actually using the power of food to help people understand climate change. So I put together a few PowerPoints, which I will now share. Does that look okay, David?
Yes.
David, are we okay?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So, and about 20 minutes, David, is that correct?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So here's what I talk about: our changing menu, using food to teach or educate about climate change. And in the days when we all were teaching with masks, I occasionally give seminars on campus to students, and with a mask, they don't know what I look like. So I include this image. And the point here is, I can't talk about climate change without including some humor. It's just, I think it's really extremely helpful. So climate change basics, that's the troposphere, the orange band. It's a very thin layer, and here we are using an apple as a way to represent that. If you think of the peel on the apple, that's essentially in a way a reflection of how thin the layer is that we live in on the surface of the earth. And most people don't fully appreciate that it's all happening in a 7-mile high layer, or again, the peel on an apple. A little more humor. I think you've seen this before. That is me, but the idea is the atmosphere is filling up with greenhouse gases. So another way to look at it is a bathtub filling up with greenhouse gases. So why food? When we're communicating about climate change, it has to be relevant. We can think about the economy, we can think about biodiversity, human health, but it's hard to beat something as relevant as food, since we all eat. It's part of cultures, family traditions, it's emotional. I will get to a story about a mole sauce I had last week at a restaurant, and I almost told the waitress that I was going to cry because it was so good. So we enjoy it. We also enjoy the social lubricants, the alcoholic beverages that are part of food. It's easy to talk about, and because there's so many types of food, so many ingredients, there are unlimited stories to tell, and linking it to climate also provides unlimited stories. The audience for this message is the rich world, especially the US. Basically, first of all, where does food come from? Most people go to the grocery store and buy what they want, but do they realize avocados mostly come from Mexico? We import most of our avocados from Mexico. That Brazil nuts don't come from Brazil, they come from Bolivia. That fish sticks originate from the North Sea, Bering Sea, caught by the US fishing fleet, shipped to China for processing and imported into the US as fish sticks. This entire global system is getting a little riskier. There's a ship in the Panama Canal, but big ships are having a hard time to get through because of drought and the water level is dropping. Lower is an image of the Mississippi River, which is now at the record lows. Typically 70 million tons of grain are transported for export from farmers in the Midwest, but the barges are dragging bottom right now, and it's a really big deal in movement of food. So let's drill down. That's kind of the big picture, but take a crop plant. What's happening to it? It needs air, carbon dioxide, water, the right amount of water, the right temperature, soil, and sunlight. Everything for that plant is changing except sunlight. So again, we're teasing out all that's happening to our food now, starting with crop plant. Climate change deniers say, well, increasing CO2 is great because it is beneficial to about 95% of our crops, but in general, the consensus is that's nice, but more extreme weather inside is going to offset any benefit from increasing CO2. Weeds will become harder to control in agriculture as CO2 increases. The big one here is human nutrition. B vitamins in rice will decline by mid-century by about 30%. There'll be less protein in some of our other staples like wheat, as well as essential minerals as CO2 levels increase. But plant breeders hopefully can stay up with this change. All kinds of interesting changes in flavors and colors. Apparently carrots will get lighter in color with the climate change, with climate changing. And all this one, this is what's happening to veggies. A lot of good things, actually. Increase in fructose, glucose, soluble sugar, antioxidants, capacity, total phenols, flavonoids, ascorbic acid. And I hope this kale actually tastes better. Water, global shifts, again, in where it falls, when it falls, how it falls. More extremes, downpours are up 55% in the Northeast. That's a challenge to agriculture. About 84% of the US is now in some type of drought. It's warmer, more precipitation falls as rain, less snow. This obviously affects the snowpacks out west, and ice melts. We import $5 billion worth of food from Peru and Chile A lot of that is dependent on irrigation water coming from melting ice caps in the Andes, which will be gone in 20 years. And there's so many aha moments in this story. Hail in parts of the US will get bigger with climate change. It's warming, but I'm just going to focus on one or two things. The big one is winters are warming twice as fast as summers. So in 1917, Georgia, the peach state, had very, very few peaches because the previous winter was too warm. About the same time, pistachio growers in California lost several $100 million in production because the previous winter was too warm. Fruit, almost all fruit and all nut trees require a winter chill. They have to go into a dormant phase. And if they don't do that, they don't yield. That's the result with warming, means they don't go into that dormant stage. They don't produce fruit. And in time, food production in the US and around the world is going to move north. And that's actually there will be actually a dramatic shift starting in 2050, 2070 of production north. So what does this mean for students? So everything pictured here is changing. And I'm just going to work through these slowly. For the right age groups, our lubricants are changing. Wine grapes are affected by high temperatures, more acidic. The aroma of wine changes produced from wine grapes that are affected by high temperatures. The flavors in the future, we'll probably still have wine, but we better get used to different varieties and different types of wine because they'll be switching to more resilient varieties, plus production is moving north. Beer, think of the Pacific Northwest, where most of our hops come from, a lot of water stress in that part of the world and high temperatures. Salads, if you look at a salad, avocados production in California will drop by 40% in the next couple of decades. Lettuce production may actually expand because of warming winters, but then what about a salad dressing? I just love looking at the labels on salad dressings because here's an example of ingredients in a salad dressing. Mustard in big trouble because of production problems in the Canadian prairies this year. Lemon juice, the citrus industry in Florida got hit with Hurricane Ian recently, really hit the citrus industry. Onions will become more pungent. Most olives and olive oil comes from Spain, where drought and high temperatures are taking a toll on that crop. Stories that can be told in the classroom or elsewhere. Pizza. There's olives. Tomatoes, tomato sauce, it's in the news. California produces most of our processing tomatoes, which goes into ketchup, and production is going to be off by 10% this year, presumably affecting the amount of ketchup available or price. That's the other thing that's changing. The dough here is made out of wheat. In time, the nutritional quality of that will change. Cheese, hot cows give less milk. More stories. Mexican food. Here's the mole. On the left, the ingredients in typical mole sauce. Chilies will get hotter with climate change. Sesame seeds, 40% of which come from Tanzania. They love the new conditions, hotter and drier, and production is actually increasing, benefit farmers in that part of the world. Almonds, as you hear in the news, use a lot of water. Raisins are grown in California. Most of them come from California. Again, they're facing the drought. Garlic is starting, but garlic, you feed it to cattle, they produce less methane. Cloves are in trouble in the Spice Islands. Chocolate at the bottom comes from Western Africa. Drought, high temperatures affecting cacao production there. And let's just focus on the meat here. In general, the US production of beef is going to stay as it is. We're not losing, but ranchers in the Southwest that produce and raise beef cattle before they go to the feedlots are in really big trouble because of the drought affecting grazing lands. So they're selling their cattle earlier than they normally would. They might feed them on grass for most of their life, then they go to the feedlot, but now, hey, the grass isn't there, they're shipping them. It's having a huge impact, and frankly, on their futures. Sushi, 99% of the sushi we consume in the US comes from California, and we know what's happening in California. There isn't enough water. Cookies, I mean, it's just, you can just use your imagination. There's maybe a jam in there, fruit of some kind. That's going to be affected by that loss of winter chill. I mentioned chocolate, vanilla, natural vanilla, most comes from Madagascar, which is being hit by hurricanes. And I'm not going to talk about this one. Coffee around the world is in trouble. So this is serious. Without ice cream, there would be darkness and chaos. And melting glaciers are bad enough, but for me, loss of coffee is downright terrifying. So here's a little game everybody can play. You grab your computer or smartphone and put in your favorite foods. Climate change followed by your favorite foods. So climate change followed by cheese. Here's what I enjoy. And 50 to 75% of the time, you're going to find a story. You can also put in here foods you may not be really about or enticed by, but that's my son-in-law being forced to drink a kale drink by my daughter. So we're both sort of pushing back on eating kale as much for humor as anything else. More stories. Perfumes, they're plant-based, they're changing. Pet food is changing. Yes, textiles, cotton, silk, and wool, etc., are changing because of climate change. Medicinal herbs because of climate change. More stories for all of us to tell. We did a survey recently, a national survey, and found, because no one's really researched that people really care about climate change in their food. So this is one of the first studies, well, the first study ever conducted. Not shown here, both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats, about 80% are concerned about food choices, and 60% of Republicans are concerned. So it's an opportunity to cross that political divide using food. The numbers shown here are for the youngest age class in the survey, and that was 18 to 35. That's just the nature of the survey, but 82% of those in that age class are concerned about choices. 85 willing to pay more if they know that's grown in a climate-friendly way. 90% almost are interested in learning more. And talk about food often, or 83% of that young group do, but rarely do we talk about climate change in the US. About 2/3 of us never talk about climate change. So it seems like an opportunity to start that conversation using food. What's being done? Whenever and I think most of us give a talk about climate change, you have to have solutions. So farmers and ranchers are doing a lot, the stewards of the land. The food industry is making progress. We've got a long ways to go. Science is contributing to new varieties, more resilience in our crop plants, etc. And to me, this is another opportunity to convey a story about what's the value of science. And what can we all do? There's a long list of things we can do, but as Catherine Hayhoe says, starting to talk about climate change, number one. Here again, can we start talking about climate change using food? And if somebody read the book that we wrote and said their 9-year-old just bothers everybody at school now because he knows what's happening to what they're eating, and he keeps telling people. We can also use dining halls on campus. This is very early in its early stages, but all students go to the dining halls to eat. All majors go there. Can, in fact, we arrange for educational opportunities using food in dining halls? And there's this group called the Social Gastronomy Movement that actually helps facilitate sort of roundtable discussions using food, which could take place in dining halls. We've written a book, which I think you're aware of. The core of that is essentially a menu from before dinner drinks all the way to coffee and dessert. There's a website that includes a database of food ingredients and how they're changing. These activities have been well received. We're trying to raise awareness and action on climate change using food. And I'll wrap up with that. That I just like, it seems we have an opportunity to use the power of food to educate. Because again, we all eat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's both sobering and I think powerful and provides lots of opportunities. So why don't we take a few minutes to have questions for Mike or comments, responses to Mike's presentation, and then after we've done that for a little bit, then we're going to turn to Eben Goodstein to talk a little bit more about the worldwide teaching on climate and justice. Let's focus first on Mike and this whole idea of our changing menu and using food to talk and teach about climate change. So you could either unmute yourself, or if you want to ask something, or put a question in the chat, or raise your hand if you want to do that. So I guess while others are thinking of questions, Mike, maybe you could just talk a little bit about the kind of response that you are getting to this approach of our changing menu.
I have yet, and maybe today will be different, been told that this is not a good idea. Oftentimes there's essentially an aha moment like, well, of course, why can't we do this with food? I've been invited to do, I'm losing track, 10 podcasts already, over the last several months. I'm speaking at the association, by being invited at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. Recently, we spoke at the Culinary Institute of America, very well received. I'm now part of what's called the Menus of Change University Research Collaboration, and spoke in Texas a while back on that. The positive feedback we're getting is just continuous. We just submitted a proposal to kick this whole thing up via social media to really get the word out that we think this is an approach that other people should know about.
Excellent, excellent. Anne, why don't you go ahead? Anne Brown.
Hi, thanks. I'm an En-ROADS ambassador, and I just learned at our last meeting that they will be creating a food tool within the En-ROADS model. I wonder if you're familiar with it, and if you have any comments about how we can use that as a way to teach about food and climate. Thanks.
And before Mike answers that, Anne, why don't you, En-ROADS is a fabulous educational system, but I would bet that not everybody on here knows about it. So if you wouldn't mind giving us just a couple minutes about En-ROADS, please.
Sure. Okay. En-ROADS was developed by Climate Interactive and MIT, and I can put the link in the chat. It is a tool for testing out 18 different climate solutions through policy changes and things such as taxation, incentives, et cetera, to gauge the effect of these actions on global temperature rise and many other metrics, including co-benefits, such as enhancing biodiversity and equity, the fairness for all people. So we've had food kind of embedded in the methanes and other emissions category, which calculates things like nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizers and, of course, raising livestock as a methane producer, et cetera. So now they're talking about making food a more transparent and really specific. I'm not sure if they're developing a whole slider about food, but I was curious to know if you're aware of what they've done and if you've been consulted or tried it or anything. Thank you.
I'm aware of it, just sort of glanced at it, but is the tool like the story I'm telling, or is it a tool about the carbon footprint of foods, so people make the right choice?
Well, what it does is it really looks at impacts on global temperature rise as kind of the main thing. So in other words, if you were to move your slider towards regenerative agriculture practices, you would then lower the greenhouse gas emissions and store more carbon. So you'd get a better result on global temperature rise. I'm sorry, I can't be more
So it's
detailed than that.
Yeah, so the En-ROADS is really on a different scale in terms of a global scale, looking at simulations of CO2, and I think what you're talking about, Mike, is on a very more specific scale of education around particular foods.
Yeah, because typically there's sort of a negative connotation, in many cases legitimate, about food. So we're just flipping that story to use power of food to bring about change. So I'm including a link in the chat to our website to respond to a couple of questions relating to ingredients, where we can find more information about the impact of climate change on food ingredients.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I can see with the connection with En-ROADS is that food, in the way that Mike is talking about it with our changing menu, is a way to raise people's awareness on climate impacts. And then when they want to learn more and what kinds of things then they can do, then if somebody can use the En-ROADS system, which is an educational system that then uses modeling to say what are appropriate solutions and how can you be engaged in them, then they may be more ready for En-ROADS. So yeah, so the question, since not everybody is able to read the chat, is I really like the idea of choosing a popular food and breaking it down into ingredients and how climate is affecting those ingredients. Do you have a reliable source we can consult to share facts about those ingredients when we're talking to folks? And then this person, Amna, suggests that maybe creating an infographic to teach people. So Mike, do you want to just talk a little bit more about the website and where one would find that kind of information on our changingmenu.com?
Well, we'll start with the book, which has, I don't know, a few hundred ingredients in it and what's happening to them. But the website does contain a searchable database of food ingredients and how they are changing because of climate change. Ultimately, that database could have maybe 1,000 ingredients because there are so many different kinds of foods ingredients out there. Right now, I think it has maybe 150, so it's not comprehensive. But again, back to the question, the trouble we had in writing the book was being overwhelmed with information, because you start looking at impacts of climate change, let's say in natural vanilla. Well, most of it's grown in Madagascar. That's okay, but it's also grown in Indonesia and it's also grown elsewhere. So each of those regions of the world may have different climate change conditions. So we had to just really sort through it. So it's not that difficult. You just, again, type in climate change and a particular food ingredient and see what comes up. You should find some good information.
And Mike, most of this information has been compiled by the students at Cornell that you're working with. Is that right?
Yes.
So if others have information about particular foods and climate impacts and want to contribute to that resource set, how would they do that?
Just send it directly to me at my email address, which I will put in here.
Okay, great. Good, thanks. And then Susie, who happens to be my neighbor down the street, asks, is the purpose to give a sense of urgency on climate change, to galvanize advocacy efforts, or to encourage personal dietary choices that are more climate friendly?
All of the above. We are using food to raise the point about urgency about climate change and the threat it poses to our food. But note that I keep using the word change and not doom and gloom, and it's not a doom and gloom story. We celebrate food. We celebrate the people who get it to our table. So it is a positive story. So the big picture is, hey, if you like your chocolate and you want to keep chocolate, you start reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. And we offer advice. I think there was a little information in there about talking about climate change, becoming climate change literate, getting involved, becoming an activist. So it's basically both a broad issue of the climate change and what we need to do about it, but also downright to what we eat. As far as dietary choices, yes, that's part of the other thing. Is food waste is a big one, reduce your waste. And we encourage people to switch to a more plant-based diet. But instead of saying don't eat red meat, we basically say treat meat as a delicacy, not a staple. I'm not going to be a hypocrite because once in a while I'll have a hamburger. And the reviewer of that section in the book came back at me real hard. He said, Mike, if you say stop eating meat, you've just lost, 2/3 of the US population. So the compromise, which is still quite beneficial, is just treat red meat in particular as a delicacy, not a staple like most of the rest of the world.
Yeah, or to have it as a condiment on the side of, maybe a little bit of meat sauce or something like that. Yeah, and in terms of the local food issue, in the county where I live, Montgomery County, Maryland, actually, right now there's an online event that I'm cut out from to attend this, but the Montgomery County Food Council is looking at how do we advocate for and implement a zero food waste policy in our county, and climate is a big part of it. So, and then Indira, in India, where obviously there are all sorts of cultural issues related to food and much and lots of food insecurity. Says in India, we try to teach our students to eat local and avoid wasting food.
Absolutely. Since I'm asked often about locally grown and should we purchase locally grown as much as possible, the answer is yes, but bear in mind that what you eat is far more important than where it comes from. And I'm specifically referring to red meat.
Great. Okay. And then Anne has put another resource into the chat, and I encourage others, if you have resources you want to share, put it in the chat. What we will do after our sessions today is we will send each of you a follow-up message with a copy of Mike's slides, a link to the recording, and then also a compilation of resources that were put into the chat. So let's use that as our community resource. So now I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, Evan Goodstein, the director of the graduate programs of sustainability at Bard College and the originator and co-director of the worldwide teach-in on climate and justice, to talk about the teaching concept and sort of how you can build on some of the things that Mike's talking about with food, and work with your fellow educators and fellow community members in educating about food, climate, and climate justice. So go ahead, Eben.
Thanks, David. Mike, thank you very much for joining us today. Really fabulous work. And it is always engaging. I mean, we all love to talk about food and think about food. And I think the work that David and I have been doing over the last couple of years has been tapping into just a rising level of climate concern among educators globally. So we're at this point now where I think at any college, university, or high school in the country, in the world, 50 to 70 to 90% of the faculty are climate concerned. I mean, they're concerned about their own futures, their futures of their families and their children and their students. And obviously students are get it now, right? I think we've sort of done the basic science education we need, in the sense that anybody who wants to know about climate change can understand that basic story that Mike told about we're our Earth that's the size of an apple with the skin of an apple, and we're heating the planet up with heat trapping gases, and they understand how serious the consequences are going to be. And I think the challenge for educators now is to actually break through a widespread sense of despair and anxiety, and really energize and engage people around climate action. And because I think the common response of many students these days is just disengagement, because it doesn't seem like there's that much that they can do. We offer the opportunity: eat less meat, fly less, vote, protest. But somehow, that's not for everybody. So how do you take that mix, right, of broad awareness but disengagement with sort of the bigger challenge? And our answer is that as educators, what we can and should and must do is really excite students about the opportunity to do the work over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years that it's going to require to stabilize the climate, right? This is the work of a generation. It's the great work of this generation. And that in particular, if we teach art, we can talk about how artists are talking about climate change. If we teach chemistry, we can talk about how chemists are addressing climate change. If we teach history, we can do the same. And the purpose of this work, the Solve Climate Project more broadly, but the worldwide teach-in, is to really tap into that concern and that disengagement of many faculty with the issue, even though they are worried about it, and turn that into engagement on their part, and in turn engage hundreds of, not thousands of students on their campus. What we are calling for, and I'm going to tell you sort of something I'm going to do today, actually, to try and get my fellow faculty members engaged, but I'll leave that for a minute, is a worldwide teach-in on climate and justice, which is scheduled for on or around March 29th, 2023. Last year we did this. We had 350 colleges, universities, high schools, other organizations, about 50,000 students in 50 countries. This year we need to get to 1,000 institutions and 100,000 or 200,000 students involved, 1 million if we can get there. And we're really it's kind of a stronger together kind of thing. We're asking you to do what you might have done anyway around climate education in the spring, but make it part of this bigger initiative. And in particular, after hearing this conversation today, if you say, yeah, I want to be part of this, we'd like you to go to our website, click on register your event, and this map will pop up, right? So we just went live a couple of weeks ago. We've got about 30 events signed up around the world. We need to get to 1,000. And so we need your help. So if you're going to do something in March or April around climate change, please sign up on this website. If you do that, you don't even have to know what you're going to do at this point. You can just say we're going to be doing something on the eco-politics of care and justice at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. You can edit this little site later and add more detail, but we need your bubbles on this map because this is what inspires other people to get involved. Mike, you could just host a webinar on food justice or something with some of your colleagues or something and just put it on the map, out of wherever it's coming. So we just need events reminding the world that we are talking about climate change and that others are talking about climate change, because there's this always sense of isolation that no one else cares. And we're really trying to use this map to engage and inspire other people around the world. So please sign up as soon as possible. What can you do on that day? Well, if you go to our website and you go to the R Models page, there's lots of sort of ideas, and we could spend some time talking about that. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to ask our faculty to do today at our faculty meeting. I'm going to go in and I'm going to tell them that I'm going to make a request that they bring the teach-in into their classrooms, because I know that many of them are climate concerned. They're not climate experts, but I'm going to say, if you're teaching a history class that has nothing to do with climate change, or you're teaching an art class that has nothing to do with climate change, nevertheless, sometime in March or April, I'd ask you to take a half an hour to talk about how your discipline is thinking about climate change. How are artists thinking about climate change? How are chemists involved in kind of the climate change conversation? How are historians engaged? How are psychologists involved? With the idea really of inspiring students to say, hey, you know, I like art. I can be a climate artist, or I'm interested in psychology. I can be a climate psychologist. Or, you know, I want to be a chemistry major, and I could use those chemistry skills to help solve this problem. And really just engage students with the idea of being this great generation that does this great work that stabilizes the climate. And not every student will respond to that, but, you know, if every faculty member that I can get to do that, will reach 20 or 25 or 30 students with that message. So if I can get 20 faculty to say yes today, I'll have 400 Bard students thinking about their contribution, you know, the ways that they could get involved beyond what they can do as a citizen, right? The stuff that Mike was talking about. You know, what can they do in their careers and as professionals? So that is a very simple way that you can host a teach-in. You could get 4 or 5 or 20 or 40 faculty members to agree to do this and just put that on the map. That's what we're doing. It's not a public event. It's, you know, part of the curriculum, and that's great. Another model would be to get 4 of those faculty members together to cancel their classes and do it together on Zoom or in a, you know, or in a classroom live, right? And that would be a little teach-in. And then you can obviously carry that out to much bigger events or campus-wide events. Maybe not bigger, actually. This is actually probably the biggest event you could organize, because you can reach way more students in the classroom and you can bring them together. But this morning we had a conversation with ASU folks who've done this fabulous thing called the Turn It Around cards. We'll be displaying those cards on campus. They're really amazing artwork done by students all over the world. You flip it over and there's a statement on the back of the cards talking about student concerns around climate change. We've got a theater opportunity. We're running a theater contest, a playwriting contest of 5-minute plays that your campus theater groups could put on. We'll have some climate comedy resources on our website. So lots of different approaches to doing a teach-in, which is a bottom-up kind of educational initiative, right? It's not bring in an Al Gore or outside speaker to give a lecture or show a movie, although you can do those things. We really are trying to, how do you tap into the expertise you have on your campus? All of the climate concerned faculty and educators, how do you get them involved? Because they're the ones who can actually get their students to show up to these events. So that's why we're calling it a teach-in, you know, as opposed to a, you know, more of a, you know, show a movie or have a lecture kind of approach to climate education. That's an introduction to the teach-in. We're at worldwideteachin.org. I bet David's dropped that in the chat. Tobias Hess, who is our organizer, is here. We've got, you know, how would you get people involved in this? We do this conversation every week. So you can urge your colleagues to come and join this Wednesday sort of, we call it Talking About Climate, you know, thinking about Catherine Hayhoe's work. We're really focusing on this idea of how, as a non-expert, as a non-climate expert, can you bring climate change into the conversation as an educator? And we welcome students and faculty and staff to come and learn and engage in the teach-in this way. But again, the reality is this is a community organizing effort. We sent out lots of emails, but the only way we're going to get 1,000 bubbles on this map is if you tell other people about this and you twist their arms a little bit, you know, and you say, I know you're busy. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but you know, you really need to participate in this Make Climate a Class. I know you care about climate change. This is important. That's how we're going to spread this across the world, because There are hundreds of thousands, there are millions of climate concerned educators around the world. We have a platform that elevates their voices and makes them stronger together. So that's an overview, and love to take some questions.
Yeah, and thank you, Eben. And let me just say that Eben mentioned the Turn It Around cards from Arizona State University. We actually just had a presentation on them in a meeting earlier today. And next week at the same time and station, we will have a presentation on the Turn It Around project, which is a very exciting global project integrating art and culture and youth empowerment, and then also on what Bradley University is doing in integrating their teaching with the whole year-long sustainability program. And then on the 16th, the focus is going to be a little more on K-12 education with our partners at National Wildlife Federation, talking about our campaign to for Teach 10 Hours for Climate. And then we're also going to have a group called Write for the World that is working on writing and literacy globally in English, but a global community of that. So there were a couple of questions in the chat that Mike has been answering, but let's just bring those out in front of everybody. And then if you have questions or comments for both Eben and Mike in the last couple of minutes. So I think one important question that we ought to just be very clear in terms of stating is to look at the impact of climate change on food through the lens of equity. And Samia from Morgan State mentions that urban farmers in Baltimore City are now disrupting food supply chains since the pandemic hits the urban food deserts the hardest. So Samia, did you want to elaborate on that at all? Because I think that, you know, when we talk about food, that you know, it's an existential issue for many people around the world, including in the United States.
Sure. Sure. I think the pandemic definitely had a massive impact on the designated food deserts. And Baltimore has about 16,850, to be precise, empty lots and vacant properties. So basically, neighborhoods just took those properties during the pandemic and started growing food. And now it's a movement. And the city is very scared because it's very difficult to move people who have now taken food sovereignty in their hands. So much so that now Aldi wanted to open up a grocery store, and the Urban Farmers United and said, no, we don't need you anymore. You never came to us before. We don't need you anymore. We are food sovereign. So the issue of food sovereignty and being able to not have to work to bring food to your table is a big movement, and it's empowering my students who have actually started thinking, wait, if we can grow our food and if we don't have to work for food, then what are we working for? And that has made them so creative. And I've seen the creativity pour out in the urban design studios just by that click of empowerment food sovereignty gives to creativity. So if you're working just to put food on your table, you're in a fight and flight mode. Any neurologist will tell you that. Creativity happens when people are food sovereign. So I'm hoping that we can at some point use the data that we have on climate change and its impact on food, which is fabulous. And I've really enjoyed this talk, and make it into a movement that basically deals with the supply chain in a different way. The disruption of the supply chain, can we continue it?
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, and obviously this is an opportunity also for the higher education sector, especially land grants. University District of Columbia, which is the land grant in Washington, D.C., has an effort building community gardens and community markets in all wards of the city. A different question, this one's for Eben in the chat from Susie, is for, especially beyond academia, for people and organizations that have the interest but don't necessarily have the bandwidth to put together some of the content on their own. What kind of curriculum resources, videos, and other resources are available, especially for people around the world who are climate concerned, but maybe not feeling like they're particularly climate informed?
Well, what I would say would be that even if you're not feeling like a climate expert, you can organize a climate teach-in. It can be as small as you want it to be. It can be a booth in a farmer's market. Someone had that up there. It can be a discussion session at your church or synagogue. It can be a lunch and learn at your business. All of those things can count as a climate teach-in, and not feeling like you know enough is no excuse not to organize one, because we all know enough to know that this is important. There's just zillion, billion, jillion resources on climate. So it really depends on what you want to learn, and kind of the approach you want to take. And we have some of them listed on our website, but our focus is, our little piece of this has been focusing on really providing resources for educators, and also connecting the community of people who are providing resources for educators. We've had National Wildlife Federation, Subject to Climate, the writing group that David talked about. So it's really interesting as you start to dig into this, how many people are providing great educational materials. I think there's no shortage of that. It's really just a question of what your approach is and what you want to learn and communicate.
Yeah, it even mentioned Subject to Climate. That was the group, they did our webinar 2 weeks ago, and that's recorded and is on our website, I think both on the homepage and on our resources page. And subjecttoclimate.org is a searchable database for curricular resources about climate change, primarily K-12, but some undergraduate education, and they're sorted by subject area and grade level. So for example, if you were teaching 5th grade English, that you could search, and there actually are climate related lessons for 5th grade English teachers, et cetera. So, and Tobias just put that in the chat. So we have time for maybe one last question or comment from anybody. Well, again, I want to thank you all for joining us today and for the work that each one of you is doing. I know there's, we could have any one of you here talking about the important work that you're doing, and have an exciting presentation for the others to learn with. I will mention that, I don't know if you put it in the chat yet, Tobias, but Tobias created a Google group, which is really just kind of getting underway, but that's also a place for us to be a community, sharing resources, sharing ideas, asking questions of each other, and learning and working together. Because as Eben said, I think, among the challenges that we have is that leadership is important, but it's sometimes lonely. And so to the extent that we can support you as climate educators and climate leaders, we want to be doing that. So again, thank you for all of your time today. We will be, the weekly meeting is same Zoom link, same time. Remember that next week we move from daylight savings time to standard time in most of the United States. And so before, if you're not in the United States, check your local time zone converter next week. We do use the same link, but we do prefer that you register so that we can record that. And again, we will share with you a link to today's discussion, Mike's slides, references, resources from the chat, etc. And if you want to listen again, join us tonight at 9, same Zoom station, and tell your friends to join us at 9 as well. So
And
thank
please
you all.
do sign up. Do sign up today.
Especially thank you to Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And please do sign up today for the map. Make that commitment. We know you can pull something together, no matter how small or how big. So that's your important to do. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Mike and David, for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.